The payment 6 years ago. The one he made her to disappear. The one nobody was supposed to know about. Now a journalist has the receipts. Cameras surround their home. Their 3 children are asking questions. And everything they rebuilt together is about to collapse. But the truth? It's even more complicated than anyone thinks. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. 6 years ago, Amara Washington made the hardest decision of her life. She was 24 years old, working as a junior financial analyst at one of the most prestigious banks in the city. Her life was calculated, controlled, exactly the way she liked it. Every decision was weighed, every risk assessed. She had climbed her way up from nothing, from a childhood of struggle and poverty, and she was not going to let anything derail her future. That was until she met David Chen. He came into her life like a storm, unexpected and overwhelming. David was a white American millionaire, a venture capitalist with a reputation for being brilliant, charming, and ruthless in business. He was 15 years older than her, already established, already powerful. He noticed her during a presentation she gave at his investment firm. Afterward, he approached her with a smile that made her forget her own name. Within weeks, they were dating. Within months, she was in his penthouse apartment, believing she had found everything she wanted. Amara had never felt this way before. She had always been careful with her emotions, keeping walls high and expectations low. But David made her feel seen, understood, special. He showered her with attention, bought her things she never knew she wanted, took her to places she had only dreamed about. For the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting to survive. She was living. She was happy. Or at least, she thought she was. Then she became pregnant. The day she found out, Amara sat in the bathroom of her small apartment, staring at the positive test with shaking hands. Her first instinct was panic. This wasn't part of the plan. She was supposed to make senior analyst by 30, supposed to have a house of her own, supposed to have control over every aspect of her life. A baby didn't fit into that timeline. A baby would change everything. She called David immediately. His response was silence, then a long breath, then words that would change the trajectory of her entire existence. He told her they needed to talk, that he would send a car for her. When Amara arrived at his office that evening, she found him standing by the window of his corner office, looking out at the glittering city lights below. He didn't turn around right away. He just stood there, shoulders tense, jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was different from what she had ever heard before. It was cold, calculated, distant. He told her that a child was not something he wanted. He had never wanted children. He had been careful, he said, but apparently not careful enough. He turned to face her then, and the look in his eyes made her stomach drop. It wasn't the look of someone in love. It was the look of someone who had just realized they had made a mistake. David laid out his terms like they were negotiating a business deal. He would pay for everything: the abortion, the medical bills, 2 years of living expenses. Enough money for her to start over somewhere else, somewhere far away from him and his world. All he asked was that she disappear, that she terminate the pregnancy, accept the money, and never contact him again. That she never tell anyone about the baby, about him, about any of it. He even offered to help her relocate to another city if that would make it easier. Amara felt like the world was spinning. She listened to him explain how this was the best solution for everyone, how she was young and had her whole life ahead of her, how a baby at this stage of her career would ruin everything she had worked for. He wasn't wrong. She knew he wasn't wrong. Part of her wanted to agree, wanted to take the money and disappear, wanted to go back to her carefully planned life. But another part of her, a part she didn't know existed until that moment, wanted to keep the baby, but she couldn't afford to keep the baby. She had no savings to speak of, no family to help her, no support system. She was alone, and David had made it clear that if she kept the child, she would be alone and poor. He would not be involved. He would not help. There would be no father, no financial support, no connection to his world. And he made it very clear that if she ever tried to involve him or use the child to gain access to his money or his life, his lawyers would make sure she lost custody and faced legal consequences for any attempts at extortion or manipulation. Amara spent 3 days deciding. 3 days of crying, thinking, praying for an answer that never came. She had lived her entire life running from poverty, terrified of ending up back where she started. The offer David made was a lifeline. It was security. It was the chance to get her career back on track without the burden of motherhood. Rationally, it made sense. Emotionally, it felt like the end of the world. She made the appointment. She went through with the procedure, and the whole time she felt like a part of her was being taken away. Afterward, sitting in David's penthouse while he made arrangements for her relocation, she felt hollow. Empty. Like she had made the right decision for all the wrong reasons. The money arrived, transferred into an account David set up for her. Enough to live comfortably for 2 years. Enough to start fresh somewhere new. David arranged a transfer at her bank to another city, somewhere neutral, somewhere where they would never accidentally run into each other. He even provided a substantial bonus to ensure her silence, a legal agreement that she signed, swearing never to speak of what happened. Amara left that world behind. She moved to a smaller city, took a position at a regional bank, and tried to build a new life. She tried not to think about David, tried not to think about what she had done, tried to move forward. And slowly, the wound began to scab over. Not to heal, but to become numb. She threw herself into her work, climbing the ladder again, rebuilding her career from this new foundation. But she never forgot. Late at night, alone in her apartment, she would wonder what the baby would have looked like. Whether it would have been a boy or a girl. Whether she had made the right choice, or if she had just taken the easy way out. The guilt sat with her like a shadow, always there, always present, growing heavier with each passing year. Then, 6 years later, everything changed. Amara had worked her way up to senior vice president at her bank. She had become one of the most respected financial strategists in the region. She had a nice apartment, a good salary, the financial security she had always craved. But she was alone. She had never dated seriously since David, never let anyone close enough to hurt her the way he had. Her career was her entire life, and in many ways that was exactly how she wanted it. Or so she told herself. The merger was announced on a Tuesday morning. 2 major investment firms were coming together, combining their portfolios and their resources. Amara's bank was being brought in to manage the consolidated finances. It would be the biggest project of her career. When she saw the names of the principals involved in the merger, her breath caught. One of them was David Chen's company. She considered stepping back from the project. She could have made an excuse, claimed a conflict of interest, asked to be reassigned. But that would have been running. And Amara had spent 6 years trying to prove she was strong enough not to run anymore. So she stayed on the project. She told herself it would be fine, that she was a different person now, that what happened between them was ancient history. The first meeting with David's team was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the main conference room of Amara's bank. She arrived early, wearing a professional suit that made her feel powerful, armored. She had spent extra time on her appearance, telling herself it was just because she wanted to look competent and in control. Definitely not because she might see him. And then he walked in. 6 years had changed him. His hair had more gray in it now, his face lined with the stress of building an empire. But his eyes were the same, that piercing intelligence mixed with something colder, something harder. When he saw Amara, he froze for just a moment. It was so brief that if she hadn't been watching him so closely, she would have missed it. But she saw the recognition, saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, certainly. But also something else. Something that looked almost like regret. He recovered quickly, extending his hand professionally across the conference table. His voice was smooth, practiced, professional. They had never met before, he said, or at least not in any way that would matter in a business context. Amara shook his hand, her own palm cool and steady, even though her heart was racing. She agreed that this was their first official meeting, and they both moved forward as if nothing had ever happened between them. The project moved forward over the next few weeks. Multiple meetings, conference calls, detailed discussions about portfolio integration and financial restructuring. David and Amara were in constant contact, their professionalism never wavering. To anyone watching, they were perfect colleagues, respectful and efficient. But underneath that professional veneer, there was a current of tension, a space between them that was charged with unspoken things. In the third week of the project, after a particularly long meeting, David asked to speak with Amara privately. They moved into a smaller conference room, just the two of them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, David broke the silence. He asked her if she was okay, if she had managed to build a good life for herself these past 6 years. His voice was gentler than she had expected, almost vulnerable. Amara told him yes, that she had done exactly what he had wanted her to do. She had taken the money, moved away, focused on her career, and never looked back. She said it was the best thing that could have happened, that she had gotten exactly what she needed. As she spoke the words, she realized she didn't entirely believe them. And she could see in his face that he didn't believe them either. David told her he had thought about her over the years, more than he wanted to admit, more than was probably healthy. He had followed her career progression through mutual contacts, had heard about her promotions and her success. He had been proud of her, he said, proud of what she had accomplished. But he had also carried guilt, a weight that he had never been able to fully shake. He had made a choice 6 years ago that had seemed necessary at the time. But the older he got, the more he realized he might have made a terrible mistake. Amara didn't know how to respond to that. She had spent 6 years trying not to think about him, and now he was admitting that he thought about her. She asked him why he was telling her this now. What did it matter what he felt or what he thought? That part of their life was over, but even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. It did matter. It had always mattered. And the fact that he had never been able to forget her, that he carried the weight of their decision just as she did, somehow made both of them feel less alone. Before they could say anything else, Amara's assistant knocked on the door. The next meeting was starting. They both moved back into professional mode, filing back into the conference room as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just opened a door they had thought was sealed shut. The weeks progressed. The merger moved forward successfully. Amara's work was instrumental in making sure every detail was handled perfectly, and David watched her from across various meeting tables with an expression she couldn't quite read. Sometimes it looked like admiration. Sometimes it looked like sadness. Sometimes it looked like longing for something that could never be reclaimed. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of back-to-back meetings, David found Amara alone in her office. It was late. Most of the staff had gone home for the day. He came in without knocking, closed the door behind him. He asked if they could talk. Really talk. Not the professional conversations they had been having, but something real. Amara was exhausted, emotionally drained from 6 weeks of proximity to him. She wanted to tell him no, wanted to protect herself the way she had learned to do. But something in her, something soft and wounded, said yes. They sat down in the comfortable chairs by her office window, the city lights twinkling below them just like they had 6 years ago in his office, though this time the view was of a different city, a different life. David told her everything. He told her about the years that had followed their split, how he had thrown himself into his work, how he had dated other women but never felt anything real with any of them, how the success he had pursued so relentlessly had begun to feel empty once he had it, how he had started to realize that the choice he had made, the choice she had made under his pressure, had cost him more than he had ever imagined it would cost. He told her that he had wanted to reach out so many times, that he had started emails he never sent, had picked up the phone to call her, and then hung up before it rang, that her legal agreement held him back, yes. But more than that, his own shame held him back. He had no right to come back into her life after what he had done. He had sent her away, had paid her to leave, had essentially bought her silence. And now, seeing her again, working with her, watching her be brilliant and capable and strong, he realized what he had lost. Amara listened to all of this without speaking. She felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack. This was the conversation she had wanted to have 1,000 times over the past 6 years. This was the apology she had needed. This was the acknowledgement that what had happened between them mattered, that it hadn't just been a transaction, that he had thought about her as much as she had thought about him. But she also felt angry, because apologies didn't undo what had been done. They didn't bring back 6 years they could have spent together. They didn't change the fact that she had terminated a pregnancy under pressure, that she had lived with that decision for 6 years, that she had carried the weight of his abandonment and her own compliance. She asked him what he wanted from her. Was he looking for forgiveness? Was he trying to reclaim something of what they had? Was he offering her something? She needed to know, because she couldn't afford to be vulnerable with him again. She had built her life on the foundation of his rejection, and to have him try to rebuild something now would destabilize everything. David didn't have a clear answer. He just knew that seeing her again had reminded him of who he used to be, before he became so obsessed with money and power. He was asking, in a way, if there was any possibility of something different between them. Not romance necessarily, though he didn't rule that out, but something real, something honest. Amara told him that she couldn't give him that, not right now. Maybe not ever. But she was willing to listen if he wanted to keep talking. They sat in her office until midnight, talking about their lives, their regrets, their dreams. It wasn't romantic, but it was intimate in its own way. It was two people finally being honest with each other about something that had fundamentally shaped both of their lives. When David finally left, he asked if they could do this again. Amara said maybe. She said she needed time to think, to process what was happening between them. He nodded, understanding. He said he would respect whatever boundaries she needed to set. The merger was completed successfully 2 weeks later. The paperwork was signed, the portfolios were integrated, and the project officially ended. It would have been natural for their contact to end as well. They could have gone back to their separate cities, their separate lives, and pretended that these past weeks hadn't happened. But neither of them did that. Instead, David made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He decided to relocate his company's headquarters to Amara's city. He told his partners and investors that it made financial sense, that the location would allow for better integration with the newly merged firm. But everyone who was paying attention could see the real reason. He was staying because of her. Amara didn't know what to do with this information when he told her. Part of her wanted to be flattered, wanted to believe that he was finally putting her first, but another part of her was terrified. This was David Chen, the man who had paid her to disappear. He didn't do things without calculating the benefit to himself. So what was his angle? What did he really want from her? She decided the only way to find out was to let him back into her life, carefully, cautiously, testing his motivations at every step. They started having dinner together, professional at first, then slowly becoming more personal. They talked about their work, their ambitions, their fears. David told her about his childhood, about a mother who had pushed him to succeed at all costs, about a fear of not being enough that had driven him to accumulate more and more. Amara shared her own story, about poverty and the desperate need to escape it, about the way that desperation had made her vulnerable to his pressure all those years ago. Slowly, something began to shift between them. The anger didn't go away entirely, but it became less dominant, less all-consuming. In its place, something more complicated grew. A kind of forgiveness that wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about understanding how two wounded people had made choices that wounded each other. 6 months into his relocation, David asked Amara to have lunch with him. This wasn't unusual in itself. They had lunch together regularly now. But something about his tone suggested this was different. He wanted to talk to her about something important. They met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the city. After they had ordered, David reached across the table and took her hand. He told her that the past 6 months had been the best months he could remember having in years. That being near her, talking to her, knowing her the way he was beginning to know her again, had changed him. He wanted to know if there was any possibility of them rebuilding something more than friendship. Amara's first instinct was to pull her hand away. Old patterns died hard. But she forced herself to stay present, to stay open. She asked him what he was really asking. Was he asking for a second chance at their relationship? Was he acknowledging that what had happened between them had been wrong, and he wanted to make it right? David said yes to both. He was asking for a second chance. He was acknowledging that he had been wrong to pressure her into making a choice that hadn't been truly her choice. He was saying that if she would let him, he wanted to spend the time trying to be the kind of man who would never put her in that position again. Amara listened to this carefully. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that people could change, that mistakes could be undone, that 6 years of separation and grief could somehow be transformed into something healing. But she also knew that hope could be dangerous. Hope could make you vulnerable. Hope could lead you back into the arms of someone who had already hurt you once. So she told him that she needed more time, that she couldn't just jump back into a relationship with him because he had decided he regretted the past. That if he was serious about this, about them, then he would have to be willing to wait, to prove through actions and not just words that he had changed. David agreed. He said he would wait as long as it took. He said there was no timeline on this, no pressure. But Amara could see in his eyes that he was afraid she would eventually say no, that she would eventually decide that the risk wasn't worth it. The truth was, she was afraid of that too. Over the next year, David proved his commitment in small ways. He was patient and kind. He respected her boundaries. When she needed space, he gave it to her. When she needed support, he was there. He wasn't perfect. And there were moments where old patterns threatened to resurface. Moments where he would try to solve her problems with money, or try to control situations that weren't really his to control. But when Amara called him out on it, he listened. He adjusted. He worked on himself. Amara began to believe, slowly and carefully, that maybe second chances were possible. That maybe they could take what had been broken and build something new from the pieces. That maybe, just maybe, the past didn't have to dictate the future. After a year of dating, David took her on a weekend trip to the coast. They stayed in a small cottage overlooking the ocean. On the second night, as they stood on the deck watching the sun set over the water, David got down on one knee and pulled out a ring. He asked her if she would marry him, if she would let him spend the rest of his life making up for the choices they had both made 6 years ago. Amara said yes, but with a condition. If they were going to do this, if they were going to get married, there had to be complete honesty between them. No more secrets. No more legal agreements that prevented them from talking about the past. They had to be able to speak freely about what had happened, to process it together, to move forward as people who had truly forgiven each other. David agreed without hesitation. He said he had been waiting for her to ask for that. They got married 6 months later in a small ceremony with close friends and colleagues. David's partners were confused about the sudden romantic relationship with their new chief financial officer, but they adapted quickly. Amara's colleagues were shocked but supportive. Most importantly, Amara and David had finally reached a place where they could be honest with each other. 3 months into their marriage, Amara discovered that she was pregnant. This time it was different. It wasn't a surprise that filled her with panic. It was something she and David had discussed, something they had planned for together. But the moment she saw that positive test, she felt all the old emotions rush back. She thought about the pregnancy she had terminated, about the choice that had been taken from her, about the baby that never was. She showed the test to David with tears in her eyes. He held her while she cried, letting her process the complicated emotions that came with this new beginning. They both understood that this pregnancy represented something more than just the simple fact of a child. It represented healing. It represented second chances. It represented the possibility of moving forward without being completely controlled by the past. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Amara continued to work, though she began to slow down a bit. David became more involved in her life, going to appointments with her, reading pregnancy books, preparing a nursery in their home. It was tender, and Amara found herself healing in ways she hadn't expected. And then, at her 7-month ultrasound, the technician said something that made both of them freeze. "I'm seeing 3 heartbeats," the technician said quietly. The couple exchanged a look of complete shock. Triplets. They were having triplets. Amara felt her entire world shift in that moment. One baby was big, was overwhelming, was a significant life change. But 3 babies? That was everything she had ever feared, and everything she had ever wanted all at the same time. She looked at David's face and saw tears running down his cheeks. He was smiling, but he was crying. After they left the ultrasound office, David held her hand in the car and asked if she was okay. Amara didn't answer right away. She was processing the enormity of what was about to happen. 3 babies, 3 lives, 3 chances at being the mother she had always wanted to be. The chance she had given up 6 years ago. Finally, she told David that yes, she was okay. She was terrified, but she was okay. And more than that, she felt something she hadn't felt since she was a young woman standing in his office 6 years ago. She felt hope. Real hope. Hope that her life had been leading her somewhere meaningful. That all the pain and regret had been part of a journey that was about to transform into something beautiful. David squeezed her hand and told her they could do this. That they could handle 3 babies. That they would figure it out together. That this was their second chance, and they were going to get it right this time. As Amara sat in the passenger seat of their car, one hand on her still small belly, the other holding David's hand, she thought about the woman she had been 6 years ago. That woman had been so afraid of losing control, so desperate to maintain her perfect life plan, that she had made a choice she had regretted every day since. She wondered if that woman could have imagined this moment, if she could have seen that the path that seemed like failure could actually lead to something extraordinary. The months that followed were a blur of preparation and anticipation. The pregnancy became more public as Amara's belly grew large with 3 developing babies. Her colleagues at the bank threw her a shower. David's business partners congratulated them. The world knew that a pregnancy had changed Amara's timeline, but they didn't know the full story. They didn't know about the first pregnancy, about the choice that had been made in desperation and regret. Only Amara and David knew that full story, and they held it between them like something sacred, something that had brought them back together, something that had transformed both of their lives. Amara's 9th month came faster than anyone expected. Her belly was massive, stretched tight with the weight of 3 developing babies. Walking had become difficult. Standing for more than a few minutes left her exhausted, but she refused to stop working completely. She came into the bank 3 days a week, handling administrative tasks from her office, refusing to let her pregnancy dictate her entire existence. David worried constantly. He wanted her to go on bed rest immediately, wanted her to stay home where he could monitor her, wanted to control every aspect of her pregnancy in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of how he had tried to control her choice 6 years ago. But she pushed back, gently but firmly. She told him that she understood his concern, but she needed to maintain some sense of independence, some sense of control over her own body and her own life. After what had happened before, that control was essential to her healing. One afternoon, while Amara was working at her desk, she felt the first contraction. It wasn't painful, just a tightening sensation, a Braxton Hicks that she had experienced many times over the past few weeks. But something about this one felt different. Something about the way her body shifted made her pause and pay attention. She called David immediately. He picked up on the first ring, as he always did when she called during her work hours. She told him she thought something might be happening, that she was feeling contractions. His response was immediate. He told her not to move, that he was coming to get her right now. He arrived at the bank in less than 10 minutes, which would have been impossible if the office building wasn't only 2 blocks away. He walked into her office with an expression of controlled panic on his face. He helped her gather her things, told her colleagues she was going home for the day, and drove her to the hospital. The medical team examined her and confirmed what she already suspected. She was in early labor, but her babies were still a few weeks away from their due date. The doctors explained that while the babies were developed enough to survive outside the womb, being born now came with some risks. They wanted to try to stop the labor, to keep her pregnant for at least another 2 weeks if possible. They admitted her to the hospital and started medications to slow the contractions. For the next 3 days, Amara lay in a hospital bed, her body coursing with medications, her mind filled with fear and uncertainty. David stayed with her the entire time, barely leaving her side. He held her hand through every contraction, spoke softly to her about their future, about the 3 babies that would soon be here, about how strong she was, and how he would be there to support her through everything. On the 3rd night, around 2 in the morning, Amara woke to intense pain. The contractions had returned, stronger this time, more consistent. She pressed the call button for the nurse. Within minutes, the medical team was at her bedside, checking her, monitoring the babies, discussing in low voices what they were seeing on the monitors. The doctor came in and explained that the medications hadn't worked. Her body was determined to go into active labor, and they couldn't stop it. The babies were coming whether they were ready or not. They were going to deliver her as soon as possible. Everything became urgent after that. They prepped her for delivery, explaining all the procedures, all the risks, all the things that could go wrong. Amara listened with a strange sense of calm. She had already lived through the worst moment of her life 6 years ago. Whatever happened now, it couldn't be worse than the grief and regret she had carried since then. David held her hand as they wheeled her into the delivery room. She asked him to stay with her, to be with her through the entire process. He promised he would never leave her side. The labor was long and intense. Hours of pain and contractions. Hours of pushing. Hours of her body doing what it was designed to do. At one point during the most intense contractions, she looked at David and saw tears streaming down his face. He was whispering to her over and over, telling her how much he loved her, how proud he was of her, how she was the strongest woman he had ever known. And then, finally, the first baby arrived. A girl, small but healthy, let out a cry that seemed to fill the entire room. Amara cried with joy and relief. David cut the umbilical cord with shaking hands, and they laid the baby on Amara's chest for just a moment, before whisking her away to be cleaned and checked. The second baby came 20 minutes later. Another girl, slightly larger than her sister, with a tuft of dark hair and her father's determined expression. Then, after another 20 minutes of intense labor, The third baby arrived. A boy, smallest of the three but perfect. 3 babies, 3 healthy babies, all of them here, all of them alive, all of them safe. Amara sobbed with a joy so intense it felt like it might split her open. David held her and cried with her, whispering his gratitude to her, to the universe, to whatever force had brought them to this moment. In the recovery room, after all 3 babies had been cleaned and checked and wrapped in blankets, the nurses brought them to Amara one by one. She held each of them, marveled at their tiny fingers and tiny toes, whispered apologies to them for what had happened 6 years ago, for the sibling they would never have, for the complicated journey that had led to their birth. David stood beside the bed, watching his wife hold their 3 children, and he wept openly. He had spent 6 years living with regret, with the knowledge that he had pressured the woman he loved into making a choice she didn't want to make. And now, here she was, a mother to 3. Here he was, a father to 3. Their second chance had materialized into 3 perfect human beings. The next few weeks were chaotic in a way Amara had never experienced before. 3 newborns meant 3 times the feeding, 3 times the diaper changes, 3 times the crying. She was exhausted in ways she had never been exhausted before. There were days when she sat in the living room of their home covered in spit-up, with dark circles under her eyes, and she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. This was nothing like the carefully controlled life she had built. This was nothing like the stability she had craved. But then one of the babies would smile at her, or she would watch David with one of the triplets, or she would feel the weight of one of them sleeping on her chest, and she would understand that this was exactly what she had been searching for her entire life. Not control, not a perfectly executed plan, but love. Real, messy, overwhelming, beautiful love. David hired a nanny to help during the day while Amara recovered from the birth. He also hired a night nurse for 2 weeks to help them get through the most intense adjustment period. Some of Amara's colleagues thought she would never return to work, that having triplets would force her into early retirement or a significantly reduced role at the bank. But they didn't know Amara. By the time the triplets were 3 months old, Amara was back at work part-time. By the time they were 6 months old, she was back full-time, with careful arrangements made to ensure she could still be present for her children. It wasn't always easy. There were days when she had to leave a meeting to deal with a sick child. There were nights when she barely slept because one of the babies had colic. There were moments when she questioned everything, but she did it. She balanced motherhood and career in a way that hadn't been possible for the woman she had been 6 years ago. She had changed. They both had changed. The pressure and the desperation that had driven their first encounter was gone, replaced by something more solid, more real, more sustainable. The babies grew. At 1 year old, they were walking and babbling, getting into everything, turning the carefully organized home into a place of delightful chaos. At 2 years old, they had personalities that were distinctly their own. The oldest girl was serious and thoughtful. The youngest girl was a wild child, always laughing, always moving. The boy was between them, observant and calm, the peacekeeper of the trio. On the triplets' 3rd birthday, David and Amara threw a party in their backyard. Friends and colleagues came, bringing gifts and well wishes. The 3 children sat in the middle of the yard, surrounded by balloons and presents, completely absorbed in the chaos of it all. David stood next to Amara, his arm around her waist, watching their children play. He leaned down and whispered to her that he was sorry. She asked what he was sorry for. He said he was sorry for everything, for the pressure, for the payment, for sending her away. He said that even though things had worked out, even though they had found their way back to each other, he would carry the guilt of those choices for the rest of his life. Amara turned to look at him. She told him that she had forgiven him a long time ago. Not because what he had done was right, because it wasn't, but because she understood that they had both been different people then. She understood that she had made choices too, that she had allowed herself to be pressured, that she had been complicit in the outcome. She said that holding on to anger and resentment wouldn't change what had happened. What mattered now was what they were building together. David nodded, and they stood there in comfortable silence, watching their 3 children play in the afternoon sun. But life, as it always does, threw another curveball. A year later, a journalist reached out to Amara through her work email. The journalist had been investigating David's business practices over the years and had come across some unusual patterns. She had found references to a payment made 6 years ago, a significant payment made to someone through an intermediary. She was doing a story about ethical issues in venture capitalism and wanted to know if Amara had any comment. Amara's heart began to race. She knew exactly what the journalist was referring to. The payment. The money David had given her to terminate the pregnancy and disappear. She had never told anyone at the bank about it, had never disclosed it to her employers or colleagues. It had been a secret she and David shared, something that existed in their private world. She called David immediately. His response was calm but tense. He told her that he had known this moment might come eventually. He said that the journalist had been contacting him as well, asking pointed questions. He said he was prepared to handle it, to explain the situation if needed, to face whatever consequences might arise. But Amara realized in that moment that she didn't want him to handle it alone. She didn't want him to protect her by taking all the blame, or by spinning some version of events that made her look innocent while he looked guilty. Because neither of them was entirely innocent, and neither of them was entirely guilty. What had happened was complicated, and it deserved a complicated truth. She told David that she wanted to speak to the journalist. She wanted to tell the full story, their story, exactly as it had happened. David tried to convince her otherwise. He was afraid it would damage her reputation, her career. But Amara realized that she was no longer the woman who was afraid of her reputation being damaged. She was no longer the woman who was so desperate for control and stability that she would hide the truth. She spoke to the journalist, not off the record but on the record, with her full name attached to her words. She told the story of 2 people who had made choices in desperation, who had carried guilt and regret, who had found their way back to each other and built something real from the pieces. She didn't minimize her own role or maximize David's. She told the truth, complicated and messy as it was. When the story came out, it created a minor scandal. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with opinions about whether David had done something wrong, whether Amara had been victimized, whether either of them deserved forgiveness. But something unexpected happened. Instead of the story being treated as a sensational scandal, it became a conversation about how complicated reproductive choices were, about how pressure and circumstance shaped decisions, about how people could change and grow and build better futures. There were people who judged them harshly. There were employers who expressed concern about what this story might mean for their professional reputations. But there were also people who reached out to them with their own stories, their own complicated choices, their own guilt and regret and desire for redemption. Most importantly, Amara's colleagues at the bank rallied around her. The woman who led the charge was the bank's chief executive, a woman named Patricia, who had herself made difficult reproductive choices decades ago. Patricia called Amara into her office and told her that her job was secure, that the bank supported her, and that she had shown tremendous courage in telling her story publicly. Patricia also told her that she was being promoted to Senior Vice President of Strategic Planning, a role that would give her more autonomy and more visibility in the industry. Amara cried in Patricia's office, but these were tears of relief and validation. She had been terrified that her truth would cost her everything, but instead, it had liberated her. David's situation was slightly different. Some of his business partners wanted to distance themselves from him, concerned about the public perception. But others respected his willingness to acknowledge his past mistakes and his commitment to doing better. His business moved forward, though with a renewed focus on ethical practices and corporate responsibility. A few months after the story broke, Amara received another unexpected call. It was from a woman named Keisha, who identified herself as a therapist specializing in reproductive trauma. Keisha had read Amara's story and wanted to reach out personally. She told Amara that her story had resonated deeply with her, that it had helped her understand her own past experiences with reproductive pressure. She also told Amara that she had started a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting women who had experienced reproductive coercion, and she wanted to know if Amara would be willing to serve on the board of directors. Amara agreed without hesitation. She had been given a second chance at life, had been given the opportunity to become a mother when she thought that opportunity had been taken from her. She felt called to use her platform, her privilege, her voice to help other women who had faced similar situations. Over the next year, Amara became deeply involved with the nonprofit. She worked with women who had experienced reproductive coercion, who had been pressured into abortions or into having babies they didn't want, who carried guilt and trauma as a result. She shared her story openly, not to minimize what had happened to her, but to show them that survival was possible, that healing was possible, that building a good life was possible even after the worst choices had been made. David supported her work fully. He donated significantly to the nonprofit and also became involved, speaking to other wealthy men about the ways that financial power could be used to coerce rather than to support. He also worked with a therapist of his own, processing his guilt, understanding the ways his own trauma and fear had driven his behavior 6 years ago. Their marriage deepened through this work. They were no longer just a couple trying to move past a traumatic shared history. They were partners in the work of healing, both their own healing and the healing of others. When the triplets turned 5 years old, they started kindergarten. Amara took them to school on their first day, with David meeting them afterward for a family celebration. As she watched her 3 children walk into the school building, holding hands, she thought about the child who had never been born, the one she had terminated 6 years ago. She whispered a quiet apology and a quiet gratitude. That child, though never born, had been part of her journey. That choice, though painful, had led her eventually to these 3 perfect beings. David found her standing in the hallway of the school, tears streaming down her face. He asked if she was okay. She told him that she was more than okay. She told him that standing in that hallway, watching their 3 children start school, she could see how everything that had happened before had been leading her to this moment. All the pain, all the regret, all the terrible choices had somehow transformed into this beautiful life. David pulled her close and held her, and they stood there together, grateful for second chances, grateful for the opportunity to build something real from the wreckage of their past mistakes. Years passed. The triplets grew into school-age children, with opinions and interests and personalities that continued to surprise their parents. The nonprofit that Amara served on expanded to multiple cities, helping hundreds of women process their reproductive trauma. David's business evolved to reflect more ethical practices, and he became known in venture capital circles, not just for his financial acumen, but for his commitment to corporate responsibility. Amara advanced to chief financial officer of her bank, the highest position she had ever held. She worked hard and was respected by her colleagues and her staff. More importantly, she worked in a way that allowed her to be present for her children, to maintain the balance that mattered to her. On their 10th wedding anniversary, David and Amara renewed their vows. The ceremony was small, just family and close friends, held in the backyard of their home where they had celebrated so many of their children's milestones. Their 3 children stood beside them during the vows, now 10 years old enough to understand that their parents' love story was unusual, that it included pain and loss alongside joy and redemption. Amara looked at David as she spoke her vows, and she saw the man he had become. Not perfect, never perfect, but genuine. A man who had acknowledged his mistakes and worked to become better. A man who had fought for their relationship even when it seemed impossible. A man who had chosen every day to be present, to be honest, to be committed to building a good life with her. David looked at Amara and saw the woman she had become, strong and fierce, having reclaimed her power from a place of trauma. A woman who had been broken and had rebuilt herself, not just for herself but for her children, for her work, for her community. A woman who had learned to live authentically even when authenticity was scary. They sealed their vows with a kiss as their children cheered, and the gathered friends and family applauded. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Fairy tales didn't include reproductive coercion or past mistakes, or the complicated journey back from betrayal. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was beautiful in its own imperfect way. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Amara and David sat on the porch of their home, looking out at the night sky. David reached over and took her hand. He told her that he was grateful every single day for the opportunity to know her, to love her, to build this life with her. He said that when he thought about what could have happened, about the path they might have taken if he had just let her disappear 6 years ago, it made him terrified. Amara squeezed his hand and told him that she was grateful too. She said that the path they had taken had been harder, more painful, more complicated than any other path they might have imagined. But it had also been the path that led them here, to this moment, to this life. She said that she wouldn't change it, even though there were parts of it that had hurt deeply. The years continued to unfold. The children grew into teenagers with their own dreams and ambitions. One wanted to be a doctor. One wanted to be an artist. One wanted to be a teacher. Amara and David supported all of their dreams, encouraged them to pursue whatever called to them, and taught them through example that mistakes could lead to growth, that regret could transform into purpose, that second chances were possible if you were willing to work for them. Amara never stopped working at the nonprofit. Even as she advanced in her banking career, she maintained her involvement with the organization, spending her evenings and weekends counseling women who had experienced reproductive trauma. She had become a respected voice in the field, invited to speak at conferences and universities about reproductive justice and coercion. David eventually stepped back from day-to-day management of his business, handing over control to a team of young leaders who shared his evolved vision for ethical business practices. He started his own consulting firm, dedicated to helping corporations develop more ethical policies around employee reproductive health care and parental support. He became an advocate for men understanding their role in reproductive justice, for men recognizing the ways that financial power and social pressure could be used to control women's reproductive choices. When Amara turned 40, her friends threw her a surprise birthday party. The party was held at the nonprofit's office, and many of the women she had counseled over the years were there. They shared stories about how Amara had helped them, how her honesty and vulnerability had given them permission to heal. One woman told her that Amara's story had saved her life, had given her the courage to leave an abusive situation rather than stay trapped by reproductive coercion. Amara cried listening to these women speak. She realized that the choice she had been forced to make 16 years ago had ultimately led her to a purpose greater than she could have ever imagined. The pain had been real, but it had become purposeful. The regret had been transformed into compassion. The darkness had given way to light. David stood beside her at the party, his arm around her waist, watching the woman he loved being celebrated by the community she had built. He whispered to her that he was sorry for what had put her on this path, but he was so grateful for the way she had transformed that pain into something healing for others. Years later, when the triplets were in their 20s, they asked their parents to tell them the full story of how they had come to be. Amara and David sat down with their 3 adult children and told them everything. They told them about the first relationship, the first pregnancy, the choice that had been made under pressure. They told them about the separation and the pain. They told them about the reunion and the forgiveness. They told them about the decision to have them and the shock of discovering there were 3. Their children listened carefully and thoughtfully. The oldest asked her parents how they had managed to move past something so traumatic. David explained that they had both had to do a lot of work, both individually and together. They had had to acknowledge what had happened, take responsibility for their own roles in it, and make a commitment to being different moving forward. He said that forgiveness wasn't about pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It was about deciding not to let that hurt define the rest of their relationship. The youngest child asked if either of them regretted having the triplets. Amara answered without hesitation. She said that she had never regretted having them, not for a single moment. She said that bringing them into the world had been the most healing thing that could have happened, that it had allowed her to reclaim the agency that had been taken from her, that it had allowed her to become the mother she had always wanted to be. David added that having the triplets had saved his life too. He said that being a father had transformed him, had given him a sense of purpose and meaning that his business success had never provided. He said that if he could go back and undo the choices he had made 16 years ago, he wouldn't, because those choices had led to this life with Amara, and to the 3 amazing human beings he was privileged to call his children. The triplets absorbed this information, asked more questions, and eventually came to understand their parents' journey in its full complexity. They didn't judge their parents for what had happened. Instead, they respected them for their honesty, for their vulnerability, for their willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and work toward healing. By the time Amara turned 50, her life looked nothing like she had planned it would look 16 years ago. She had expected to be single, focused entirely on her career, childless by choice. Instead, she was married to the man she had thought had betrayed her forever. She was raising 3 children who were becoming wonderful human beings, and she was doing work that directly addressed the trauma she had experienced. Her career had also reached heights she had only dreamed of. She had been offered the position of Chief Executive Officer of her bank, the first Black woman to hold that position in the bank's 100-year history. She had turned it down, not because she wasn't capable of doing it, but because she had learned through hard experience that not every opportunity was worth taking, that sometimes the most important work happened outside of corner offices and board meetings, that balance and authenticity mattered more than climbing higher. Instead, she took a position as Chief Financial Officer of a major healthcare organization, a position that allowed her to use her financial expertise to help make healthcare more accessible and equitable. She worked fewer hours than she would have as CEO, which gave her more time for her family, her nonprofit work, and her own well-being. David, seeing the way Amara had carved out a life that worked for her rather than chasing every opportunity, did something similar. He scaled back his consulting business to part-time, allowing him more freedom to travel with Amara, to spend time with their grandchildren as they eventually started arriving, to pursue interests that had nothing to do with business or success. They had learned, together, what it meant to live a life that was whole, that honored both their ambitions and their relationships, that didn't require constant striving for more, but instead allowed for presence, gratitude, and joy. When Amara turned 60, she and David sat in the backyard of their home, the same home where they had raised their children and where they had renewed their vows 20 years ago. The backyard now had the marks of a life fully lived. There were tire swings from when the children were small. There were garden beds that Amara had started tending to in her 50s. There was a bench that David had built years ago, worn smooth by time and use. Amara looked at David and said that she wanted to thank him. David asked for what? She said she wanted to thank him for fighting for their relationship, for not giving up on her even when it would have been easier to do so, for being willing to acknowledge his mistakes and work toward becoming a better man. David reached over and took her hand. He said that he wanted to thank her too. He said he wanted to thank her for forgiving him, for being honest about her own pain, and about her own role in what had happened, for allowing them both the possibility of redemption. He said that their journey together had been the greatest education of his life, that knowing her and loving her had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who had been through terrible things together, who had hurt each other and been hurt by each other, but who had chosen to keep choosing each other. Two people who had built a life not despite their past, but somehow miraculously, because of it. As the sun set over their backyard, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Amara and David sat hand in hand, grateful for second chances, grateful for the opportunity to build something real and lasting from pain and regret, grateful for the life they had created together and the family that had grown from their decision to try again. This was their story. Not a story of perfect love or easy redemption, but a story of two flawed humans who had made mistakes, who had hurt each other, who had faced the consequences of those mistakes, and who had found a way to transform pain into healing, regret into purpose, and broken dreams into something even more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. And they lived, not happily ever after, because life was never quite that simple, but well. They lived with intention and honesty and love. They lived with the knowledge that second chances required constant work, constant recommitment, constant choice. And every single day they chose each other. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.